There is a cotton field in Humphreys County, Mississippi, that looks like every other field around it. Flat, dark, turned over every spring by a tractor that has no reason to slow down. Underneath that field, roughly 3,300 years ago, a river flood buried a city. Not a metaphor, not a turn of phrase for a village that simply got old and forgotten. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. An actual flood on an actual river bend sealed an actual settlement under several feet of silt so completely that when archaeologists finally cored into the ground in the 20th century, they found architecture with no surface trace at all. You can stand on that field today and see nothing. The ground gives away none of what it's holding. The site is called Jaketown, and it sits on what geologists call a point bar, the crescent-shaped sandbar that forms on the inside curve of a meandering river. People started living there around 1700 years before Christ, part of a wider cultural tradition archaeologists call the Poverty Point culture, named for the earthwork complex 60 miles away in northeast Louisiana that became its most famous expression. For decades, the assumption was that Poverty Point came first, and everything else, including Jaketown, followed its lead. Recent radiocarbon work has complicated that story. Soil cores taken at Jaketown reveal a landscape of constructed ridges and hollows laid out in a pattern strikingly similar to the 6 concentric rings at Poverty Point itself, and some of the Jaketown dates come back earlier. It's possible the blueprint ran the other direction. It's possible this quiet stretch of the delta, not the more famous site to the south, is where the idea started. To understand why that matters, it helps to look south at Poverty Point itself, because the scale of what these people accomplished is not a small claim. Around 3,700 to 3,100 years ago, communities with no farming, no draft animals, no wheels, and no permanent villages in the sense archaeologists usually mean, organized enough sustained labor to raise 5 mounds and 6 concentric ridges arcing across more than half a mile of Louisiana bayou country. One recent estimate from a Washington University research team puts the moved earth at roughly 750,000 cubic meters, carried basket load by basket load. Researcher Tristram Kidder has described it in blunter terms, comparing it to something like 140,000 modern dump truck loads of dirt, all without a single wheel involved in the moving. For a long time, the working theory was that a project of that size required a chief, someone with the authority to compel that much labor. Newer analysis leans a different way, suggesting a temporary, voluntary gathering of egalitarian communities who came together periodically to trade, to worship, and to work, then dispersed again. Nobody has settled the question. What isn't contested is that Poverty Point was, for at least 2,000 years afterward, the largest and most complex thing anyone on this continent had built, and it was raised by people the old textbooks assumed were too simply organized to attempt it. UNESCO recognized it as a World Heritage Site in 2014, one of a small number of American locations to receive that designation. Jaketown sat inside that same trade world, close enough to receive its material culture, old enough in places to have anticipated some of it. Archaeologists excavating there have pulled out worked stone that did not originate anywhere near the Mississippi Delta. Material carried in from sources hundreds of miles distant, hand to hand or boat to boat, through a network that left no ledgers and no writing, only the stone itself as its own receipt. Some of it arrived at the site as partially finished blanks, rough-shaped and ready for final work once they reached their destination. Artifact studies tied to this broader Poverty Point trade network trace material back to the Ohio and Tennessee River valleys and to the Appalachian foothills of Alabama and Georgia, a catchment area covering a huge portion of the eastern half of the continent, all of it moving without a single beast of burden or a wheel to carry it. This was not an isolated pocket of foragers. It was a working node inside something that reached across a large stretch of the continent, functioning long before anyone in this hemisphere had metal tools or a written record to describe it. The scale of that organization still divides the archaeologists who study it. One camp reads the mound and ridge construction at sites like Poverty Point as proof of an early chiefdom. a leader with enough authority to direct labor on that scale over years. A newer body of research argues the opposite, that the earthworks were raised without any central elite at all, through repeated voluntary gatherings of separate bands who traveled in for shared ritual and construction work, then went back to their normal scattered lives. Neither camp disputes the underlying fact that unsettles the older textbook model. Complex, coordinated monument building on a continental trade network did not wait for farming to show up first in this part of North America. It arrived while the people doing it were still living as hunters, fishers, and gatherers, which is exactly the kind of detail that keeps getting revised as new radiocarbon dates come in, rather than settled once and left alone. Then, sometime after roughly 1300 years before Christ, before the Poverty Point culture had even reached its full expression at the type site to the south, the river did what rivers on this stretch of the Mississippi Valley have always done. It moved. A flood, or a sequence of them, dumped alluvium across the point bar and buried the late archaic landscape under sediment thick enough that the ridges and swales disappeared from the surface entirely. The people who built Jaketown did not leave a ruin standing in the open for later generations to marvel at. The delta simply covered their work and moved on, the way it has covered so much else since. The site went unexcavated until 1951, when archaeologists James Ford, Philip Phillips, and William Haag conducted the fieldwork behind the first major report on it, published through the American Museum of Natural History, and even then, the oldest and most significant layers lay well below anything a visitor walking the surface could see. Decades later, artifacts collected at Jaketown during that 1951 season, and again in the 1970s, sat uncatalogued in storage at the University of Mississippi, an entire teaching and research collection that had never been fully analyzed or written up, until a graduate student took on the project as a thesis and began working through it box by box. That kind of gap, a real excavation happening, real material coming out of the ground, and then decades passing before anyone finishes studying what was found, is closer to how most archaeology in the Delta actually proceeds than any single dramatic breakthrough. Progress here tends to look like a box in a university basement finally getting opened, not a headline. Later, people kept living at Jaketown for centuries afterward, straight through the era of Mississippian mound building, more than 2,000 years later, leaving pottery in the upper soil that dates as late as 1500 of the current era. One stretch of ground, one long, unbroken residence, with an entire buried civilization sealed beneath the one that eventually grew on top of it. In 1975, roughly 6 acres containing the 2 surviving mounds were conveyed to the state of Mississippi for preservation. The site was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1993 and named a National Historic Landmark in 1990. Most of its 200 original acres remain in agricultural use. That pattern, a city vanishing not through some singular catastrophe, but through slow burial, repeats itself across the Delta if you know where to look. 60 miles north of Jaketown, outside the city of Greenville, sits a very different kind of site, not archaic traders, but a fully organized ceremonial and political center built more than 2,000 years after Jaketown's oldest layer went under. It's called Winterville, and unlike Jaketown, its mounds were never buried by a river. They were leveled by tractors. Winterville was built and used by Mississippian-era people, roughly between the years 1000 and 1450, with evidence suggesting occupation may have continued later still, into the 1600s, right at the edge of the written record in this part of the continent. At its height, it held at least 23 earthen mounds, arranged around 2 large plazas, a landscape engineered for gathering, trade, and ceremony, rather than dense everyday living. Archaeological evidence indicates that most of the population who used Winterville actually lived scattered across the Delta on family farmsteads, coming into the mound center for feasts, rituals, and the political business of the polity. Only the highest-ranking religious and political leaders appear to have lived permanently at the center itself. It functioned less like a walled city and more like a capital that filled with people only when the calendar or the crisis demanded it. Winterville was never the largest center of its kind. Roughly 300 miles north, near modern St. Louis, the Mississippian city of Cahokia grew into the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, home at its peak to a population some archaeologists estimate rivaled contemporary London, built around a central mound larger in footprint than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Winterville was a regional centre, not a metropolis on that scale, but it belonged to the same broad cultural horizon, the same general toolkit of platform mounds, plazas, and chiefly authority that produced Cahokia further up the river and Etowah and Moundville off to the east. Understanding Winterville means placing it inside that wider Mississippian world rather than treating it as an isolated curiosity, one node among many in a network of mound-building societies that covered a huge portion of the eastern half of the continent for roughly 500 years before European contact ended almost all of them, mostly through disease that traveled faster and further than any Spanish or French expedition ever did on foot. The tallest of Winterville's mounds, sometimes called the Temple Mound, still rises 55 feet above the delta floor, one of the tallest surviving mounds anywhere in the United States. Excavations on some of the smaller mounds turned up repeated layers of burned and rebuilt structures on their summits, evidence of buildings ceremonially destroyed by fire and reconstructed on the same footprint again and again over generations, a ritual cycle written directly into the layers of dirt. On other mounds, archaeologists found what looked like residences, likely belonging to political or religious leaders whose homes were built to sit physically above everyone else's. Excavators have also identified wall trenches marking earlier structures and evidence of a causeway once connecting parts of the site, features that only came to light through patient, decades-long fieldwork rather than a single dramatic discovery. In 2007, a University of Southern Mississippi excavation near one of the mounds uncovered a large refuse pit, a midden, packed with broken pottery and the bones of squirrel, rabbit, and waterfowl, dated to roughly the year 1200, material that looks very much like the leftovers of a large feast, possibly connected to the very act of raising the mound above it. More recently, surveys using soil boring equipment located a structural floor beneath the plaza that had never been mapped before, a reminder that a site excavated on and off for more than a century can still surprise the people studying it. None of this was unknown or hidden in the sense of a secret. It was simply left alone, then ploughed. The first formal excavation at Winterville came in 1907, when antiquarian archaeologist Clarence B. Moore tested 15 of its mounds along with the surrounding grounds, uncovering domestic architecture and artifacts that gave the first real academic picture of the site. But over the following decades, as cotton agriculture and road building expanded across the delta, the site received no formal protection. Of the original 23 mounds, only around 11 or 12 survive today. The rest were leveled, some for highway construction, some simply flattened by farmers who needed the acreage and had no legal obligation to spare them. There was no single decision, no order signed by one official that erased more than half of a several hundred-year-old ceremonial complex. It happened acre by acre, decade by decade, through ordinary agricultural expansion that nobody with the authority to intervene seemed to think was worth stopping until well over half the site was already gone. The site's modern museum, a low building set into the landscape so it barely rises above the mounds around it, holds pottery, tools, and bone recovered from a century of excavation, and its education programs have grown considerably in recent years, with summer sessions now drawing well over 1,000 schoolchildren a year, compared to a few dozen when the programs first started, alongside an annual Native American festival whose attendance has climbed into the thousands. That growth matters because for most of Winterville's post-excavation history, public awareness of the site lagged far behind its actual significance, one more symptom of the underfunding that has shaped how much of the Delta's mound landscape gets studied and preserved at all. It took until 1939 for any part of Winterville to receive formal protection, when the Greenville Garden Club led a local effort to purchase 42 acres of the site and convey it to the city. The state ran it as a park from 1960 until 2000, when responsibility passed to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, the agency that still oversees it and consults with federally recognized tribes with ancestral ties to the land. Serious modern excavation did not arrive until 1967. when Lower Mississippi Survey archaeologist Jeffrey Brain led an extensive dig whose full findings were not published until 1989 in a report titled Winterville, Late Prehistoric Culture Contact in the Lower Mississippi Valley. Between Clarence Moore's initial dig and Brain's full excavation sat 60 years in which the site existed mostly as a known but under-examined feature of the local landscape, its mounds visible to anyone driving past, its meaning still mostly unrecovered. There is a further thread running through Winterville's story that historians have never been able to close. Radiocarbon dating suggests the site was likely abandoned sometime before the first documented European contact in the region, which arrived with the Hernando de Soto expedition, which crossed the lower Mississippi Valley between 1540 and 1542. The chronicles kept by members of that expedition describe a powerful polity they called Quigualtam, ruled by a chief who refused to meet de Soto in person and instead sent word warning the Spanish to leave his territory. De Soto's men never actually reached Quigualtam's principal town, but some archaeologists believe the polity's territory extended into the area around Winterville, and that the mound center may already have been in decline, or already abandoned, by the time the Spanish passed nearby. De Soto himself never made it out of the delta. He died of fever during the campaign, and his men, wary of revealing his death to a population they had spent months threatening, are said to have weighted his body and sunk it in the river near a camp called Guachoya, close to what is now Lake Village, Arkansas, directly across the water from the Mississippi Delta. Whether Winterville and Quigualtam are the same place has never been settled, and the written record behind the question is shakier than it might first appear. 4 separate accounts of the De Soto expedition survive. One, by an anonymous Portuguese soldier known only as the Gentleman of Elvas, was published in 1557. Another, a formal report to the Spanish crown, written by Luis Hernández de Biedma, was filed in 1544, but not published for the public until the middle of the 19th century. A third, kept by De Soto's own secretary, Rodrigo Rangel, survives only in a heavily condensed form embedded inside someone else's later history. The fourth, and by far the longest, by Garcilaso de la Vega, was not published until 1605, more than 60 years after the events it describes, built from the second-hand recollections of aging survivors and 2 other men's rough manuscripts. These 4 accounts do not always agree with each other on basic details of the campaign, and modern historians studying the expedition's route through the southeast have had to cross-check them against the ground itself, matching described rivers, towns, and travel times to archaeological sites, to figure out which parts of which chronicle can be trusted. Locating Quigualtam with any precision means running that same kind of triangulation, and the delta's overlapping mound sites, several of which sat close enough together to plausibly be confused with one another, even by people who had walked through the region themselves, make it a genuinely difficult problem rather than a puzzle anyone has been sitting on the solution to. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. None of what's described above came from guesswork. It came from a fairly unglamorous set of tools, radiocarbon dating, refined over the decades into something precise enough to place a single feasting pit at Winterville within a few decades of the year 1200, rather than somewhere vague across a 500-year span. Soil coring, a technique that lets archaeologists pull a narrow column of earth up out of the ground without excavating the whole surface, which is how the ridges and swales under Jaketown's ploughed fields were mapped without disturbing the fragile stratigraphy sealed beneath them. At Poverty Point, researchers have more recently turned to LIDAR, a laser-based aerial mapping technology that strips away tree cover and topsoil in the resulting imagery and reveals subtle rises and depressions in the earth, invisible to someone standing on the ground. None of these tools produce a single dramatic reveal. They produce incremental corrections, a date pushed 20 years earlier here, a previously unmapped ridge confirmed there, the slow accumulation of a picture that keeps getting more detailed without ever quite arriving at a finished state. That is what real fieldwork in the Delta actually looks like, and it is considerably less tidy than any single documentary can make it sound. Jaketown and Winterville are not isolated cases. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History maintains something called the Mississippi Mound Trail, a network connecting dozens of earthwork sites scattered across the delta, many of them reduced to low rises in the middle of active farmland, some marked with nothing more than a small roadside sign. Most of these places were never systematically excavated at all. They were noted by a passing surveyor sometime in the 19th or early 20th century, entered into a state site file, and then left to whatever the next several decades of agriculture did to them. A local historian, or a farmer with a family plot going back generations, will sometimes tell you they've got a mound on their own land, part caved in now, that they used to dig around in as a kid, turning up arrowheads and broken pottery they kept in boxes without ever reporting them to anyone. That kind of casual, undocumented contact with the archaeological record is common across the delta, not because people are trying to conceal anything, but because there has never been enough institutional capacity to survey, protect, and excavate everything that's actually out there. The region has more sites than it has archaeologists, more history under the soil than there is funding to recover it. Some of those smaller mounds have simply been converted to other uses over the generations, propping up a house above flood level, anchoring a family cemetery, or serving as high ground for livestock during wet years. Practical adaptations by people living on a floodplain that happen to leave the earthwork itself standing, even if nobody involved thought of it as an archaeological site while they were using it that way. What strikes you, once you hold Jaketown and Winterville side by side, is that the Mississippi Delta has not lost one buried city. It has built, occupied, abandoned, and buried several, on different timescales, by different mechanisms, over a span of more than 3,000 years. Jaketown went under sediment, a river simply moving the way rivers on this stretch of the valley have always moved, indifferent to what stood in its path. Winterville went under a plow, an agricultural economy that needed flat, clear acreage and had no framework in place to weigh that need against what was already standing on the land. Neither burial was secret, neither required a hidden order or a suppressed report. The record of both sits in published excavation reports, state historical markers, and a museum you can walk into today for free. What buried these places was not concealment. It was neglect, indifference, the ordinary churn of a landscape that kept getting used for something else before anyone thought to ask what was already there. Only a fraction of either site has ever actually been excavated. At Jaketown, the oldest occupation layers remain sealed under alluvium that nobody has any current plan to remove at scale, because removing it would destroy the very stratigraphy that makes the site scientifically valuable in the first place. At Winterville, more than half the original mounds are gone for good, but the 11 or so that remain have never been fully excavated either, and the people who run the site say plainly that new discoveries are still turning up most years. A structural flaw found in a recent boring survey, a feasting pit found in 2007, a rebuilt, burned and rebuilt again temple platform whose full construction sequence still is not completely mapped. The place is not finished revealing itself, and the people responsible for studying it are working with a fraction of the funding and staff a site of this scale would receive almost anywhere else in the country. There is a version of this kind of story that reaches for something stranger, a lost advanced civilization scrubbed from the record by shadowy interests, a cover-up run out of government trucks. That version is more exciting to tell, and it is not what the actual evidence supports. What the evidence supports is quieter and in its own way harder to shake off. A functioning long-distance trading culture operated across a huge stretch of this continent nearly 2,000 years before its more famous later cousin at Poverty Point, and a river erased its surface without anyone noticing for over 3,000 years. A political center, possibly linked to one of the most powerful native polities the earliest European chroniclers in North America ever recorded, sat mostly unexcavated and half-destroyed within a few miles of a modern American city for the better part of a century, not because anyone decided it should be hidden, but because no one in power decided it was worth protecting until more than half of it was already gone. No suppression was required. Ordinary neglect did the job on its own, and it very nearly finished it. That underfunding has a second, harder edge to it. For most of the 20th century, excavations like Clarence Moore's in 1907 or the early digs at Jaketown removed human remains and burial goods from these sites with none of the consultation or consent that would be expected today. A federal law passed in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, eventually required museums and agencies holding those remains to work with descendant tribes toward their identification and return, a process that is still ongoing at institutions across the country, and one that the Mississippi Department of Archives and History has had to engage with directly as steward of Winterville. It is a slower, more difficult reckoning than any single excavation report captures, and it runs underneath every other part of this story, a reminder that the people who built these mounds have living descendants with a direct say in how their ancestors' remains and belongings are treated now, not simply an academic interest in how the sites get dated and mapped. Both sites are open to the public today, and both belong, in the fullest sense, to the descendant indigenous nations whose ancestors built them, including the Choctaw and other Mississippian descendant communities who maintain living ties to this landscape. You can walk the plaza at Winterville and look up at the 55-foot rise of the Temple Mound, one of the largest earthworks east of the Mississippi, still standing on its original footprint. And you can climb the smaller mounds around it, though not the largest, which the Department of Archives and History asks visitors to leave undisturbed out of respect for the site's continuing significance to descendant communities. You can drive past the cotton fields around Jaketown, though there is far less to see there, precisely because what matters most about the site is still underground, in sediment layers a soil corer can reach, but a casual visitor never will. Neither trip requires special access or advance permission. Both are a short drive off a state highway, in a part of Mississippi most tourists pass through on their way to somewhere else. The Mississippi Delta is flat, agricultural, and unassuming in almost every direction you look, mile after mile of soybeans and cotton under a sky that takes up most of the view. It gives no visual sign that it has been continuously occupied, abandoned, buried, rediscovered, and half destroyed again, on a loop running back more than 3,000 years. Nothing about the drive tells you that. The evidence is not hidden from you. It is simply beneath you, the way it has always been, waiting on the next excavation, the next flood, the next furrow cut by a plow that has no idea what it is about to turn over. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.